I spent half my life taking the lives of animals until the day a Bigfoot taught me how to lower my gun. That was the confession of Harlan, a weathered old hunter. In a remote ravine, he risked his life and broke the rules of the deep forest to save a giant Sasquatch, being brutally surrounded by 3 grizzly bears. Instead of attacking the man who helped it, the creature silently followed him all the way home. It never crossed the fence. It only left quiet gifts. But the human world never leaves secrets alone. When a young, fame-hungry hunter discovered the creature and set a trap for the beast, Harlan was forced to make a choice. Would you protect a monster or stand with your own kind? Leave a comment and subscribe to Bigfoot Sasquatch Stories as we open tonight's file together.
Hello, I'm Victor. Welcome to Bigfoot Sasquatch Stories, where we uncover stories that live on the line between what humans believe is true and what we're not ready to accept. Even though the characters and events are works of imagination, the emotions and philosophical truths they carry are deeply real. Harlan Ward had a habit of waking before daylight, making black coffee, then sitting at the kitchen table and looking across into the living room. His log house sat on the western slope of the Cascade Range. People in that area knew him, an old hunter, a quiet man, his right foot dragging slightly when he walked, living with a black lab with a gray muzzle, and a wall full of things that had once run and breathed beneath the trees.
In the old days, that wall made Harlan feel calm. Roosevelt elk antlers, grizzly hide, cougar teeth, old photographs of him back when his shoulders were still broad. He didn't brag. Anyone who stepped into that living room understood. 40 years in the mountains doesn't write itself onto a man's face in words. It writes itself in scars and in what hangs on the wall. After the fall at Mill Creek Bluff 3 years earlier, everything slowed down. A wet slab of rock had slid under his boot. Harlan fell 14 feet, enough to shift his hip, make his right knee unreliable, and leave behind a dull ache whenever the weather turned cold. After that, he didn't go as deep into the woods anymore. Coffee went cold more often. The living room wall began to look back at him. He didn't call it regret. Harlan didn't like soft words. He had lived by the laws of the forest as he understood them. People eat, animals eat, winter takes the weak. But on some mornings, he would look at the antlers on the wall and no longer remember the feeling of winning. He remembered the animal's white breath in its final minute, remembered his own hand pulling the trigger with perfect accuracy. If anyone had asked Harlan what he was looking for near the end of his life, he would have given a dry laugh. He wasn't looking for salvation. The forest doesn't keep a moral ledger. It only holds tracks until the next rain. But inside him was a question that refused to become words. After 40 years, what had he left behind besides shell casings and empty spaces where an animal never stood up again? On a Wednesday morning in early November, Harlan went into the woods without meaning to hunt. That was what he told himself as he pulled his waxed jacket from the peg by the door and took the old Winchester out of habit. That rifle had been with him longer than many people in his life. Carrying it was like carrying a knife, matches, and water. You didn't always use it, but leaving it behind made you feel hollow. The air was cold and damp. His right leg had hurt since the moment he got out of bed. The old trail along the west side of the ravine was covered in wet maple leaves and rotting pine needles. Harlan knew every raised root, every loose stone. Fog hung in the salal bushes, making the air smell of black soil, mushrooms, and dead wood. Far below, at the bottom of the ravine, the creek struck the rocks with a sound like someone pouring gravel into a big metal bucket. He leaned on a short walking stick, the rifle slung over his right shoulder. A raven called once, then went silent. Harlan stopped, turned his face into the wind, and caught the heavy, damp smell of animals mixed with freshly torn mud, maybe from the night before. He took another 10 yards, and then the growling rose from below the ravine. It wasn't one single growl. The first sound came from a grizzly, and Harlan knew it immediately. Thick, rough, with a vibration in the throat like stone rolling. Then a second sound layered over it, then a third, shorter, almost panting. Multiple bears. Bears don't usually gather like that unless there's food, a carcass, or prey trapped in a place it can't run from. And beneath it all was another sound, much lower, like a final warning. Harlan moved to the edge of the ravine, placing each step sideways so his right foot wouldn't slip, then knelt behind a fallen trunk. Morning fog still pooled down in the bottom, but not enough to hide everything. He pulled the small binoculars from his chest pocket, wiped the moisture off them with the edge of his shirt, and looked down. 3 grizzly bears were circling a patch of mud near a dry creek bed. 2 were large adults, and the third was smaller but quicker, its wet fur clumped in dark mats. They didn't charge all at once. The one on the left stepped in, lowered its head, and faked a swipe. When the creature in the middle turned to block it, the bear on the right pressed closer. The smaller one circled behind. It was the patience of animals that knew their prey couldn't leave. A creature stood half-crouched in the mud, taller than the bears, even without fully straightening. Black-brown fur covered its body, wet with mist, stuck with dead leaves and red mud. Its shoulders were enormous. Its right arm, long and muscled, braced against a low rock to keep its balance. Its left arm was pressed tight against its body, but what held it there wasn't the bear's. Its left leg was pinned to the ground by a steel trap. Harlan stared at the trap longer than he stared at the creature. 2 steel jaws clamped around the lower part of its leg, the double springs spread wide, the chain anchored to an iron stake driven deep into the mud. Harlan knew that kind of trap, not just from books or warning signs. He had used one before, 20 years earlier, when the laws were looser, when men like him talked more about efficiency than pain. An old bear trap, rough-toothed, heavy, the kind of thing that should have disappeared from this country long ago. The creature pulled its leg once. The chain snapped tight, mud sprayed up, and it growled so low, Harlan felt the sound run through the fallen tree in front of him. The 3 bears backed off half a step, then came right back in. They understood. The prey was bigger than they were, stronger than any one of them alone, but it was tied to the earth. All they had to do was wait, let it bleed, let it weaken. The forest has many deaths like that. Harlan had seen more than a few, but that trap made the whole scene dirty. He stood at the edge of the ravine for 30 seconds without moving. Later, if he ever had to tell it, he wouldn't say mercy came over him the way it does in books. No music rose inside his head. No childhood memory softened him. There was only the pain in his right leg, the smell of old metal, and a discomfort like seeing his own fingerprints on something that was supposed to have nothing to do with him anymore. One bear moved too close. The creature turned its shoulder and swung its right arm down. The blow only grazed the bear's muzzle, but it was enough to make it snap backward and roar. The smaller bear rushed in from behind, bit fast, then pulled away. The giant creature dropped to one knee, not because it was fully weak, because the trap yanked its leg backward and wouldn't let its body find balance again. In that breathing, Harlan heard a kind of exhaustion he had heard in old deer, in wounded bears, and sometimes in himself when climbing the stairs. He could have walked away, by the laws of the forest, in some way. Bears eat, prey dies. A wise man doesn't step between 3 grizzlies, especially when his right leg is bad and no one is with him. But the ecosystem hadn't put a rusted steel trap at the bottom of that ravine. Winter hadn't driven an iron stake into the mud. Bears don't buy that kind of thing out of a poacher's truck bed. Harlan lowered the binoculars and set one hand on the fallen trunk to stand. His right leg flashed with pain, reminding him that his body was no longer the body of the man whose trophies covered the wall. He heard the bears growling below, heard the chain snap tight, heard the heavy breath of the creature pinned to the ground. And for the first time in many years, the Winchester on his shoulder didn't make him feel safe. It felt heavy. He pulled the rifle down from his shoulder and checked the chamber with familiar fingers. He didn't aim. Down in the ravine, the 3 bears were still moving in a slow circle. The creature in the middle had one hand planted in the mud, its head lowered, its back rising and falling. If it could stand, maybe the story would have been different. If there hadn't been a trap, maybe the three bears wouldn't have been brave enough to keep the circle for long. But the trap was there, glinting under the fog in gray steel. He raised the Winchester toward the sky. The first shot tore across the ravine, struck the rock walls, and bounced back as a string of smaller explosions. The three bears froze. The smaller one backed toward the creek bed, ears pressed tight against its head. Harlan worked the action and fired a second shot into the air. This time, the bear on the right spun around, ran a few steps, then stopped, still not fully leaving. The other two spread out, confused by a sound that belonged neither to predator nor prey. Harlan kept the rifle pointed at the sky for another second. Thin gun smoke mixed with the morning fog, and the smell of powder touched his nose, familiar enough to be unpleasant. At the bottom of the ravine, the giant creature lifted its head. Through the distance and the wet air, Harlan couldn't see its face clearly. He only saw pale eyes inside a mass of thick fur. There was no plea in that look, no gratitude. Only pain, caution, and an awareness sharp enough to make Harlan tighten his grip on the rifle stock. It knew there was a man above it. It knew the thunder had changed the circle around it. It also knew its leg was still inside steel jaws. The three bears hadn't gone far. They were half hidden in the low brush below, growling, pulled between fear and hunger. Harlan understood he had bought time, not ended the thing. If he wanted it to end, someone had to go down there. Someone had to touch the trap. He looked at the slope in front of him. Wet earth, rotting leaves, rolling stones, slick roots. His right leg had already been warning him since morning. A smart man would stay at the edge, fire a few more shots, then go call younger, stronger rangers. But below him, the chains snapped tight again. The giant creature bent forward, shoulders shaking, its hand driven deep into the mud. Harlan let out a slow breath. He didn't call himself brave. He knew courage was often just the name other people gave to stupid acts when they didn't end badly. He only knew one thing as solid as the stone under his boot. That creature was being held by something made by humans. So walking away now wasn't respecting nature anymore. It was leaving an old mistake to keep biting into flesh and bone. He slung the rifle back over his shoulder, tightened the leather strap so it wouldn't slide loose, and started looking for a way down into the ravine. The first step slipped at once on the layer of wet leaves. Harlan grabbed a root, cursed under his breath, but didn't climb back up. At the bottom of the ravine, the three bears were still there, the trapped creature was still there, and that low sound still moved through the fog like the breath of a secret pushed to the end of its rope. Harlan Ward, a man who had spent 40 years taking lives in the woods, went down a slope for the first time with one simple thought. Today, if he could help it, he wouldn't take anything else. The second shot was still echoing around the rock walls when Harlan knew he couldn't stay at the edge of the ravine any longer. The three bears had backed off, but none of them had fully run. They spread into the low brush on both sides of the creek bed, half hidden in the fog. At the bottom of the ravine, the giant creature was still being pulled sideways by the steel trap. It had one hand planted in the mud, its back rising and falling, its breathing heavy enough for Harlan to hear over the water. Old hunters have one hard rule: don't interfere with what the forest is doing. Wolves take fawns. Bears feed on wounded elk. Winter removes the ones that aren't strong enough. That isn't cruelty, it's order. But the steel trap down there didn't belong to that order. No tree grows a spring. A human being had set that thing in the mud, then left the forest to deal with the blood. He turned and searched for a way down the slope. There was no real path, only places where the ground was a little less steep, exposed roots, moss-covered rocks, and rotting leaves. Harlan held the short walking stick in his left hand and kept his right hand on the rifle strap. His right leg objected from the first step. Pain ran from his knee into his hip, sharp and familiar. If he stopped to calculate, he would find too many reasons not to go down. So he stopped calculating. The slope was slicker than it looked from above. Rotted maple leaves stuck to the soles of his boots like grease. Harlan slid 3 feet, his left heel carving a long groove through the mud, his shoulder slamming into a young alder trunk. He blew out a hard breath, cursed under his breath, and kept going. Down in the ravine, one of the bears roared. Harlan didn't let himself look for long. The longer a man looks, the more he wants to turn back. Halfway down, he stopped behind a large rock, pulled the rifle off his shoulder, and fired a 3rd shot into the sky. The blast struck the rock walls and broke into a long, rolling echo. One bear cut across the ravine and vanished behind the salal brush. The other 2 backed away farther, but they were still there. Harlan knew they weren't stupid. They understood the sound was dangerous, but they could still smell blood. Hunger can be more patient than fear. He didn't want to shoot the bears. That surprised him. Harlan had shot bears many times in his life, sometimes for food, sometimes for bounty, sometimes for a story to tell in a bar. But that morning, the barrel only pointed at the sky. The 3 bears hadn't done anything wrong. They had seen a creature trapped in place and done what bears do. The wrong thing was the steel jaw biting under the mud, and whoever had set it wasn't there to carry the consequence. Near the bottom, the ground turned into dark mud. The smell grew stronger. Wet fur, thinned blood, cold creek water, old metal. The giant creature heard him coming. It lifted its head, and Harlan saw its face for the first time. Not the face from drunken stories at hunting camps. Not the monster face people draw on cheap magazine covers. It was broad, heavy, covered in black-brown fur around the cheeks and chin. Low forehead, large nose, lips pulled tight from pain. But the eyes made Harlan stop. Dark amber, deep, almost still in the middle of all that mud and blood. It was looking at him, weighing him, and maybe already half deciding he was another threat. The creature growled. The sound wasn't long. It came out of its chest, low and dense, enough to make the water in a small muddy pool tremble. Its right hand lifted off the ground. Harlan saw a palm as wide as a shovel, long fur-covered fingers, thick nails packed with mud. If that hand came down on him, his bones would break before he understood what had happened. Harlan stopped immediately, didn't raise the rifle, didn't step back. He just stood there, slightly bent, feet spread so he wouldn't slide. 4 seconds lasted a long time. The bear on the left snarled near the brush line. Harlan heard it, but he didn't take his eyes off the creature in front of him. He knew that if he touched the rifle now, everything would end. The creature knew it too. It looked at the barrel, then at his face. Harlan slowly lowered his right hand from the rifle strap and opened his palm. A clumsy gesture, probably not part of any language the forest knew, but he needed to say something without using his mouth. The huge hand stayed suspended in the air for one more beat. Then it lowered. It settled flat in the mud in front of the creature, fingers spread, palm pressed into the ground. It wasn't surrender. Harlan understood that. It was more like a pause, a short sentence without words. Do it, but don't mistake this for me not being able to kill you. Harlan nodded once, not knowing who he was nodding for, then knelt about 2 feet from the trap. Too close. The creature's trapped leg was long and thick as a young tree, the fur around the steel jaws wet and matted. Blood seeped out, not spraying, but enough to darken the mud. It was an old double-spring trap, the kind that had bitten deep. The steel teeth weren't as sharp as new ones, but rust had made the bite dirtier and more stubborn. The chain stretched tight from the trap ring to the iron stake driven crooked into the earth. Harlan took off his small pack and dug out locking pliers and a folding pry bar. His fingers were clumsy from the cold. One part of his mind was still counting the positions of the 3 bears, one behind the left brush, one near the creek bank, one somewhere beyond the fallen rock. Another part of him saw only the trap. He had once set this kind with 2 strong young hands, proud that it held tight. Now he knelt before the same mechanism with a bad knee and felt like he was meeting an uglier version of himself. He set the pliers against the first lock point. The creature shuddered. A low sound slipped out of it, not quite a growl, not quite a moan. Harlan stopped immediately and waited. The creature looked at him. Its breath came out hot, smelling of earth and rotten leaves. There was nothing gentle here, only 2 old bodies, wounded in different ways, caught inside something neither of them wanted to drag out any longer. Harlan tried again, slower. He had to compress the left spring first, then use the pry bar to hold the opening. His right wrist went numb from the force. Mud made the pliers slip once, shifting the trap jaw just a fraction. The creature jerked on reflex, throwing mud across Harlan's jacket. Its huge hand drove into the ground, leaving 5 deep holes. But it didn't strike. It didn't yank the leg hard. It only bowed its head and closed its eyes for half a beat, as if using every piece of awareness it had left to keep its body from betraying it. Harlan heard himself wheezing. The pain in his right leg began spreading into his back from kneeling crooked. The bear near the creek bank stepped out once, nose lifted to smell. Harlan didn't dare fire again while he was this close to the creature. The blast might panic it. He only turned his head and let out a rough, low, human growl, more anger than courage. The bear stopped, shook its head, then moved back into the fog. The first spring gave way with a metallic scream. Harlan wedged the pry bar deeper. The jaws opened part way, not enough. He moved to the second spring. This one was heavier, with rust. He had to set both hands on the pliers, lean his shoulder into it, and pull down little by little. His wrist burned. He thought of the traps he used to check when he was young, mornings spent following the trap line, finding blood dragged in circles around the stake. Back then, he had called it success. The creature made another sound. This one was shorter and broken. Harlan didn't look at its face. If he looked, he was afraid his hands would weaken. He kept his eyes on the steel, the mud, the spring, the locking notch. The work had to be done with hands, not emotion. He pulled again. The pliers slipped and struck his knuckle. Skin split. His blood dropped into the mud beside the creature's blood. That made Harlan more angry than hurt. He changed the angle, clenched his teeth, and drove the pry bar against the lock point. A dry snap rang out. The trap jaws opened almost 3 more inches. The creature didn't pull its leg free right away. Maybe it didn't understand there was enough room now. Maybe pain made it afraid of every movement. Harlan set the pliers down, reached out, then stopped before touching its fur. He had no right to pull its leg. He only backed up half a step, pointed at the opening with 2 fingers, then placed his own hand flat in the mud, copying the gesture it had given him. The creature looked at the gap in the steel, then at him. Very slowly, it pulled its left leg out. Wet fur slid across the steel teeth, leaving a few strands caught behind. When the leg came free, the creature's whole body tipped toward the rock. Harlan thought it would collapse, but the right arm braced down and held. One long breath moved through it, not like a growl, not like pain, just the breath of something no longer nailed to the ground. Harlan took the old safety clamp from his pack, temporarily pinned the jaws so they couldn't snap shut again, then cut the anchor line with the heavy pliers. The iron stake still sat in the mud, but the trap was dead as a trap. He wanted to throw it into the creek, but right now, every extra movement was dangerous. The 3 bears still hadn't gone far. Rune, though Harlan hadn't given it that name yet, still didn't have enough strength to stand. The creature bent its head and looked at the wound. Blood soaked through the fur around the ankle, dark red, mixed with mud and rust. It touched the injury lightly with the tip of one finger, then pulled its hand back. The gesture was too human, too careful, and it made Harlan's throat go dry. He dug through his pack and took out a thick roll of medical wrap and a compressed gauze pack. Since the fall at the bluff, he always carried them. At first, they had been for himself. That morning, he set them down in the mud in front of the creature. He didn't hand them over. Harlan wasn't foolish enough to turn help into a demand for closeness. He placed the roll of wrap on a flat stone, nudged it forward with 2 fingers, then stepped back 3 paces. The creature looked at the gauze pack, looked at Harlan. Its enormous hand reached out and picked it up, awkwardly but carefully. The fingers were far too large for the small object. It didn't know how to use it like a person would, but it understood this was something being given, not a weapon. One of the bears roared again, closer this time. Harlan turned his head. The 3 gray-brown shapes still moved at the edge of the brush, irritated that the meal they had waited for had been stolen from them. The giant creature heard them too. Its shoulders lifted. Everything in the ravine suddenly tightened, like a drawn bowstring. Harlan understood he no longer had a role here. He had opened the trap. He had bought more time. If he stayed, he would only add 1 weak target to the bear's calculation. He picked up the pliers and shoved them into his pack with clumsy movements. The Winchester was still on his back. He didn't pull it down. There was a strange feeling that if he reached for the rifle now, the moment that had just happened would be ruined. It would return him to exactly the man he was trying to step away from, even if only by a little. Harlan began backing toward the slope. The creature still sat against the rock, one hand holding the medical wrap, the other braced in the mud. Its amber eyes followed him for a few seconds. Not grateful, not gentle, not confused, only noting. To Harlan, that was enough. More than enough. The climb back up was worse than the descent. Going down, gravity only wanted to kill him quickly. Going up, it wanted to humiliate him step by step. His right foot slipped on the first stretch of red earth. He grabbed a root and pulled himself up, his shoulder aching where the rifle strap dug in. Below, there was no clear sound. He didn't know if the bears had come back, didn't know if the creature could stand. Harlan forced himself not to look back. It wasn't that he had stopped being afraid. He was very clearly afraid. Afraid a bear would climb after him. Afraid the creature he had just freed would change its mind. Afraid his right leg would fail and leave him lying in the ravine like an old fool. But he was also afraid that if he looked back, he would turn that moment into something that belonged to him, into a new trophy. He slipped a second time near the top. This time, his right leg folded badly under him, and white-hot pain shot all the way into his teeth. Harlan caught a thick root and hung there for a few seconds, face pressed against wet dirt. He heard his own heart beating in his ears. A piece of bark scraped his cheek. He gave a short laugh, with no joy in it. The man who had once hauled bear carcasses out of ravines with pulleys was now negotiating with a root to keep from falling. When he finally crawled back onto the trail, he lay on his side for a while in the wet leaves, chest rising and falling. The fog had thinned. Pale strips of light slipped through the trees. Below in the ravine, the creek kept running as if nothing had happened. No growling, no chain, no footsteps chasing after him, only the wide silence of the forest after it had swallowed a secret. Harlan started walking toward the main trail. He moved slowly, his right foot dragging more than usual. After about 20 steps, old instinct urged him to look back down into the ravine, just once, just to know how it ended. He stopped. His shoulder turned halfway. Then he held himself there and didn't turn any farther. He kept walking. By the time he reached level ground, his hands had begun to shake. First the fingers, then the wrists. He gripped the rifle strap tightly to hide it from no one. There was no one on the trail, no witness, no hand on his shoulder. Only Harlan Ward, muddy to the knees, cheek cut, leg burning, and a strange open space in his chest. He had fired 3 shots that morning. Not one of them took a life. For a man like Harlan, that shouldn't have been a major thing, but as he walked through the damp early November woods, he understood this was the first time in a very long while that his rifle had done its work without killing anything. It had only created distance, created time, created one small chance for the creature trapped at the bottom of the ravine to decide the rest for itself. When he got close to home, his old black lab came out onto the porch and stopped, lifting its nose to the smell of mud, blood, bear, and something else clinging to Harlan's clothes. It didn't bark. It only backed up half a step, tail low. Harlan stood in front of the porch steps, too tired to lift his foot right away. Through the window, he looked into the living room and saw the faint shapes of antlers on the wall. That morning, he didn't take them down. Not yet. Old men don't change their lives by yanking a curtain. He only stepped into the house, set the Winchester on the kitchen table instead of hanging it back in its usual place, and rinsed the cut on his finger under cold water. Pale pink water ran down the sink. Harlan watched it disappear, remembering the steel jaws opening under the mud, remembering the huge hand that had settled flat on the ground instead of swinging into his face.
And he knew, though he didn't want to name it yet, that something had followed him up out of the ravine. The first night after he came back from the ravine, Harlan didn't sleep. He washed off the mud, rewrapped the knuckles the pliers had cut open, then sat at the kitchen table with the Winchester laid across it in front of him. Not to stand guard, not because he thought the thing in the ravine would track him home. The rifle sat there like an old object that had lost its familiar purpose, making the small room feel strange. His black lab, Buck, usually demanded one last trip outside every night. He was 12 years old, gray around the muzzle, one eye cloudy, but he still kept the habit of checking the fence line, the woodshed, the trash bins, and the little trail behind the house. That night, he wouldn't go out. Harlan opened the kitchen door, and cold wind pushed in, carrying the smell of wet earth and pine resin. Buck only lifted his head from under the table, ears folded back, then tucked himself deeper into the shadows between the chair legs. Harlan called once. The dog didn't move. That got his attention more than any strange sound would have. Buck might fear thunder, and he hated the roar of big trucks, but he had never refused to step outside when Harlan opened the door. Harlan closed it again and stood still in the kitchen, listening. Out there was no growl, no branches breaking, only late fall drizzle tapping the porch roof and water dripping from the gutter into a wooden barrel. He turned off the kitchen light. His eyes took a few seconds to adjust to the dark. Through the north window, the yard appeared as a dim gray space. The edge of the yard had no real fence, only the place where thin grass gave way to thicker woods, where young firs grew close together like a dark wall. Right there, between two trunks, a black shape stood still. Harlan didn't reach for the rifle. That was the thing he remembered most clearly afterward. The Winchester was less than 6 steps away, sitting right there on the table. His hand could have found it as easily as it found his coffee cup. But he didn't. The dark shape at the edge of the woods didn't move forward, didn't retreat, didn't make any gesture at all. It only stood on the boundary, taller than the young firs behind it, its shoulders so wide that one pocket of darkness in the forest seemed thicker than the rest. Buck gave a very soft whine under the table. Harlan looked at the dog, then back at the window. He didn't know how long it had been standing there. Maybe it had just arrived. Maybe it had been there before he turned off the light. A strange thought passed through his mind. If that creature wanted to enter the yard, it would have. If it wanted to reach the porch, it already could have. The distance between it and the house wasn't something Harlan had built. It was keeping that distance itself. He opened the cabinet under the sink and took out an old metal bucket. There were still a few strips of dried salmon in the fridge. Salmon he had cured himself the week before. Harlan put the fish on an enamel plate, filled the bucket halfway with water, then stood at the back door for a long moment. He felt foolish, felt old, felt like a man trying to speak to the dark with leftovers. But in the forest, sometimes the simplest thing is the least likely to be misunderstood. He opened the door and set the bucket of water and the plate of fish on the porch step. He didn't step down into the yard, didn't call out, didn't whistle. He only set them down,
backed into the house, and closed the door very slowly by hand. The dark shape at the forest edge stayed still. Harlan pulled a chair beside the window, but he didn't turn the light back on. 10 minutes later, when his back had begun to hurt and the coffee in his cup had gone cold, the shape was gone. Not by clearly turning its back and walking away. More like the forest had suddenly taken back the thing it had allowed him to see. The next morning, the water bucket lay on its side on the porch step, empty. The enamel plate was clean, not a scrap of fish left on it. Harlan crouched and studied the ground around the porch. In the soft mud, there were several large depressions, but they stopped almost 6 feet from the step. No tracks came right up to the door. No scratches marked the wood. No sign of feral dogs or a small bear. And beside the water bucket, placed parallel to the edge of the step, was a fresh fir branch, about 2 feet long. Harlan picked up the fir branch. It hadn't fallen from any tree around the house. The branch was still green, the break fresh, clear resin sticking to his fingers where it had snapped. It had been laid in a straight line, carefully enough to be unsettling. He stood on the porch for quite a while, holding the branch like a sheet of paper he couldn't read. Buck stuck his head out the door, sniffed the wind, then pulled back inside. That day, Harlan didn't leave anything else on the porch. He told himself he shouldn't build a habit, shouldn't turn what had happened in the ravine into a cord that reached all the way home. He still had enough experience to know that the closer the forest came to a house, the more trouble followed. But that evening, as he sat alone eating canned soup, he heard rain falling on the roof and saw the fir branch still lying on the kitchen table, neat and straight, like an answer. After dinner, he set out more dried fish and water. The next morning the fish was gone. The water was low. This time, beside the bucket, there were 3 round stones from the creek bed, arranged in a line. Harlan knew those stones. They were blue-gray, smooth, found only in the lower stretch of creek, nearly half a mile from the house. No one had picked them up and accidentally dropped them in a straight row on his porch step. He squatted down and touched each one. They were icy cold, still wet on one side, as if they had been carried up during the night. Nothing dramatic happened in the days after that. No roar in the yard, no hand striking the door, no scene large enough to tell anyone without being laughed at. Only evenings when Harlan left a little food on the porch step, and mornings when something else was there. A strip of birch bark, still fragrant with sap. A bundle of dry grass tied clumsily with vine. Some mornings, only a glossy black stone placed in the center of the clean enamel plate. Harlan didn't call it an exchange at first. That word sounded too human. He didn't call it gratitude either. That word was even worse. But he began noticing that he chose the food more carefully. Dried fish that wasn't too salty. A piece of frozen venison thawed just enough to soften. Once he left half an apple, and the next morning it was still there, untouched, with a small fir branch laid diagonally across it, like a quiet refusal. Harlan gave a very soft laugh when he saw it. The dark shape didn't appear every night. Sometimes the edge of the woods stayed empty for 3 nights in a row. Harlan still left water, and in the morning the water would still be there. On those nights, he found himself irritated for no good reason. He sat in front of the television without knowing what was on. Buck slept under the kitchen table, less afraid now, but whenever the wind shifted from the north, he raised his head and listened. On the 4th night, the shape returned, standing in the same place between the 2 fir trunks. Harlan saw it and realized he had breathed out more easily. That was when the name Rune came to him. There was no grand reason. He had once read the word on a sign in the town museum, old carved marks, ancient symbols, something written before modern readers fully understood it. The creature at the edge of the woods felt like that. Not a pet, not a friend, not a monster. A sign, standing in the dark, clear enough to know it meant something, but not clear enough to translate. Rune never stepped into the yard. Harlan checked many times, not out of suspicion, but habit. The large footprints always stopped at the edge of the thin grass. From there to the porch step, if there were marks at all, they were scattered points where an object had been placed by a long arm. Once, after rain, he found a deep knuckle print in the mud nearly 4 feet from the water bucket. Rune had reached in, taken the food, set down its own offering, then drawn back without crossing that open space. And stranger still, Harlan didn't feel insulted by that distance. Some part of him felt spared from having to pretend he was in control. Rune stood out there. Harlan stood in here. And between them lay a clean space neither one tried to fill with speech or force. That strange courtesy kept Harlan awake. For 40 years he had crossed through everything. Through creeks, through brush, through shallow dens, through deer bedding areas, through the tracks of sows and their cubs. He went because he could go, because the woods were wide, and a man with a gun can easily mistake wide for permission. Now an 8.5-foot creature, strong enough to break his porch in half, stood at the edge of his yard every evening and didn't cross a line it had drawn for itself.
One evening, Harlan sat longer than usual by the north window. The kitchen light was off. Behind him in the living room, the antlers still hung on the wall. Buck lay under the chair at his feet, no longer whining, but not fully asleep either. Outside in the trees, Rune stood still. No rain fell. A thin moon hung in the clouds, just enough to show the slope of the creature's shoulder for a second before it disappeared again. Harlan set one hand on his right knee, where the pain still gnawed, like a small animal that refused to leave. He thought about the day in the ravine, about the huge hand placed flat in the mud, thought about the medical wrap being picked up by clumsy fingers, thought about the first fir branch, the 3 creek stones, the birch bark. There were no words between them, no agreement spoken aloud, and yet the past few days had held more order than many conversations he had had with people. He turned his head and looked at the living room wall. In the dark, the antlers were only black lines jutting out from the wood. Harlan had once believed they proved he understood the forest. That night, for the first time, they looked like proof of a man who had entered someone else's home too many times and brought things back to hang on his own wall. When he looked back toward the window, Rune was still there, not coming closer, not asking for more, not threatening him, just standing outside the boundary, patient enough to make Harlan ashamed. He didn't say a word, but in his mind, the final question at last formed clearly. Who had taught him that every boundary in the forest was his to cross? That night, before going to bed, Harlan took the first fir branch from the kitchen table and placed it on the north windowsill, not as a trophy, not as a keepsake, only so the next morning, while making coffee, he would still see it there, and remember that some encounters don't have to touch you to leave a mark. Derek Cole showed up on a Saturday afternoon, just as the rain was stopping, and the woods behind Harlan's house were still steaming with moisture. The road to Harlan's place didn't lead anywhere. It was a dead-end gravel drive that curved past the woodshed, ended at the back porch, then disappeared under thin grass. So when Derek said he had just been passing through, Harlan only looked at him for a moment, then opened the door wider. Derek was 28 years old, tall and lean, his shoulders always slightly pitched forward, as if he were getting ready to rush into the next thing. 5 years earlier, he had followed Harlan for one elk season, learning the trade. Back then, Derek had been younger, louder, always asking about wind direction, hoof marks, shooting angles, and how to read dry scat in the rain. Harlan didn't like talkative people, but he had let the kid come along because Derek handled cold well and didn't complain. At the time, that had been a high enough standard. Now Derek stepped into the house wearing a blaze-orange jacket, new boots, and a phone tucked in his chest pocket like a kind of charm. He carried the smell of gasoline, gas station coffee, and mint vape. Compared to Harlan's house, everything on him was too bright, too clean, too eager. But Harlan didn't hate Derek. That was what bothered him. He recognized the kid.
There had been a time when Harlan had looked at the woods the same way, as a place waiting for him to prove something. A big track was an opportunity. A strange roar was a story. A good hide was honor hung on a wall. Young men often think proof is what makes truth real. If there's no photo, no body, nothing to lay on a table for other people to see, then the truth feels unfinished. Derek had exactly that in his eyes. Harlan had once had it too. He invited Derek in for coffee, not out of warmth, just the old mountain courtesy. A man who has come to the door on a cold afternoon gets to sit down, even if you know he's hiding half his reason for being there. Buck lay under the kitchen table, his head on his front paws. The dog sniffed Derek once, then turned his face away. Harlan noticed, but said nothing.
In the kitchen, Derek talked about this year's hunting season, about grizzly hide prices dropping, about people down in town claiming they had seen strange tracks near the old forest road. He spoke in a tone half joking, half probing. Harlan poured coffee into an enamel mug, set it in front of him, then sat in the chair across from him. The Winchester was no longer hanging on the wall. It was in the gun cabinet. Derek looked at the empty place where the rifle used to be, but only for a second. Then his eyes drifted toward the north window.
That window looked straight out toward the edge of the woods, where Rune usually stood on clear evenings. The recent rain had softened the ground. Near the thin grass boundary, several large footprints still pressed into the soil, their edges blurred, but their size impossible to mistake. Harlan had tried not to look at them too much, not because he had forgotten, because every time he looked, he felt responsible for keeping them from becoming somebody else's story. Derek saw them right away. His eyes stopped for less than a second, but long enough. Harlan knew that kind of pause. Every hunter has it when he sees a track worth something. The body stays seated, the mouth keeps talking about something else, but inside, the man is already bending down to measure length, depth, and direction. Derek lifted the coffee mug, took a drink, then asked if Harlan had been seeing bears around the house lately. Harlan set his own mug down. He didn't circle around it. Old age takes many things, but it gives a man permission to skip the small games. He told Derek not to come back here looking for whatever he thought he had just seen. His voice wasn't loud, it wasn't threatening, just straight as an axe handle. Derek laughed and acted like he didn't understand. Harlan kept looking at him. The laugh faded. Derek said he was only curious. Everybody was curious. If something was out here, the world should know. A very young sentence. Harlan heard it and felt tired, not angry. The world should know. That sentence had opened the road for too many ugly things. New roads cut through old-growth forest, crowds coming in to photograph dead animals, poachers calling themselves explorers. Harlan didn't argue. He only repeated, slower this time, that Derek should leave the northern woods alone. The kid nodded. Young people nod easily when they don't plan to listen. Derek finished his coffee, said it was still bitter as mud, asked after Harlan's right leg, then left as the afternoon began turning purple behind the firs. Harlan stood on the porch and watched Derek's truck back down the gravel drive. Red taillights blinked through the misting rain. Buck stood beside his leg, the fur along his neck raised slightly. Rune didn't come that night. Harlan still set the bucket of water on the porch step. In the morning, the water was untouched. The dried fish was untouched too. He didn't know whether he felt relieved or disappointed. All day Sunday he moved around the house more than necessary, looking at the ground, the brush, the edge of the woods. No new tracks. On the kitchen table the first fir branch had dried, its needles turning dark green, but he still didn't throw it away. Monday was quiet too. On Tuesday, near midnight, Harlan saw Rune's shape far back between the firs, there and then gone. There was no gift the next morning, only one deep footprint at the old boundary, then retreat. That made him understand that Rune knew something was wrong too. The creature read Harlan's yard better than many people read the newspaper. On Wednesday morning, Harlan found the first camera. It was hidden in the hollow of a dead cedar at chest height, the bark scraped just enough to conceal the lens. If Buck hadn't stopped and sniffed too long, Harlan might have missed it. A small camouflage camera, black strap tied around the back of the trunk. The lens pointed toward the porch step, where he usually left the water bucket and the plate of fish. Harlan took it down and held it in his hand for a while. Not surprised, only cold in the gut.
The second one was 15 yards farther out, fixed beneath a broken fir branch, angled toward the forest edge. The third sat near the base of a maple, low to the ground, positioned to catch the big footprints if Rune came in for the food. Derek had placed them well. Not amateur work. 3 overlapping angles, almost no blind spots. If Rune came, the kid would get pictures, maybe video, maybe the one thing a man who hunts strange stories spends his whole life wanting to show off. Harlan took all 3 down, not rushing, not smashing them right away. He brought them into the kitchen and lined them up on the table. 3 little black plastic eyes sat there, small and silent, but they made the whole house feel cramped. Buck sniffed them and backed away. Harlan made coffee, let it go cold, forgot to drink it. On the small screen of one camera, he saw a few captured clips: empty porch, rain, a squirrel, then a distant patch of darkness at the tree line at 2:17 in the morning. Not clear enough to sell to anyone yet, but clear enough to make Derek come back. He removed the batteries, pulled out the memory cards, and dropped everything into an empty coffee can. He didn't call Derek, didn't drive into town to throw them in his face. Anger would have been easier. But that night, what kept Harlan awake wasn't anger. It was understanding. Cameras were only the first step. A man who wants proof doesn't stop at cameras, especially once he believes he has seen the shadow of something impossible. He sat in the dark beside the north window. No food set out, no water. The porch step was empty. Rune's shadow didn't appear. At times, Harlan thought the creature might have left for good, and that thought made the house feel safer and poorer at the same time. He looked at the living room wall. The antlers, the grizzly hide, the cougar jaws were still there. Things that had once been proof. Things he had once brought home so nobody could doubt he had done what he said he had done. Near 1 in the morning, the rain stopped. The wind shifted up from the creek. Buck gave a very soft whine, not sleeping. Harlan dozed in the chair for about 20 minutes, then woke from a dream of chain rattling. There was no real chain, only water dripping from the gutter. He sat up, his right knee stiff as wood. The night was still dark. The house smelled of old coffee and damp leather. Before dawn, the sound of metal snapping shut came from the direction of the creek bank. It wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. A dry, heavy sound with a special kind of echo that a man who had ever set a trap would never forget. It traveled through the dark woods, through wet grass, through the house walls, and straight into the part of Harlan's memory he didn't want opened. Buck sprang up, hit his head under the table, then stood rigid, tail tucked tight. Harlan said nothing. He already knew. Not with certainty from reason, but in his gut. Derek hadn't only set cameras. He had placed something near the creek bank, where Rune's tracks had once gone down to drink. Maybe a cage trap, maybe a foot trap, maybe some stupid invention learned from the internet and reinforced by hunger for fame. The sound of metal just then was not a sound of the forest. Harlan stood too fast, and his right leg nearly gave out. He braced one hand on the table and waited for the pain to pass. The gun cabinet in the living room was 12 steps away. Inside were the Winchester, the short shotgun, and an old .44. He had lived long enough to know that going into the woods before dawn, with a trap out there and a young man carrying weapons, wasn't something you should do empty-handed. His hand had almost already reached for the key. He went to the cabinet. Standing in front of the glass door, Harlan looked at his reflection, gray hair tousled, old sweater, one shoulder lower from pain, red eyes after a sleepless night.
Behind the glass, the guns lay in their proper places, clean and familiar. He only had to open the cabinet. Every old part of him understood that choice. A gun meant distance. A gun meant the loudest voice when everything went wrong. A gun meant not letting a 28-year-old Derek decide the rhythm of his heartbeat. But in his mind, he saw an enormous hand placed flat in the mud, not a weak hand, not a surrendering hand, a hand that could have crushed the bones of his face that day, but had lowered itself instead. Harlan remembered the sound clearly when that palm touched the ground, mud pressing out between the fingers, one small, wet sound, almost swallowed by the creek. That gesture had saved them both. Not the rifle, not an explanation, just one choice not to do what it could have done. Harlan stood in front of the cabinet longer than he needed to. Buck watched him from the kitchen doorway. Outside in the woods, after that sound of metal, everything had gone quiet, too fast. He saw the key in his hand. He didn't remember taking it. Then he set the key on top of the cabinet. He didn't take a gun. There was no beautiful moment, no music in his head, no feeling that he had suddenly become another man. Only an exhausted old hunter, right leg aching, breathing through his mouth in a dark room, deciding that if he walked out there with a gun, he might use it. Maybe not on Rune, maybe on Derek, maybe only to threaten him. But once you bring a gun into a story like this, the gun starts writing its own part. Harlan didn't want to let it write anymore. He pulled on his waxed jacket and packed the locking pliers, folding knife, a short coil of rope, flashlight, and first aid kit into his bag. Old habit made him add a pair of heavy leather gloves. He stopped on the porch step and looked north. It wasn't light yet. The firs were only one heavy black mass. From the creek, there was no other sound. That silence was exactly what made him move faster. Buck wanted to follow. He stepped onto the porch, then stopped at the edge, whining softly. Harlan placed a hand on the dog's head and pressed gently. The dog stayed. This time, he didn't need another old creature dragged into what human beings had already made messy. The path down to the creek was wet and dark. The flashlight made a narrow circle of light ahead of his boots, showing roots, sharp stones, and rotting leaves. Harlan didn't move quietly the way he used to. His right foot dragged through the grass with a soft scrape. Every step made him feel his age more clearly. But something in him moved ahead of his body. The need to arrive before Derek did something that couldn't be taken back. He didn't think of Rune as a friend. That word was too easy, too human. He didn't think he was protecting a monster either. He only thought about the empty space between the forest edge and his yard, where Rune had stood night after night without crossing. Thought about the 3 creek stones lined up in a row, thought about the cameras hidden in trees, the trap snapping shut in the dark, and the way humans so often break a silent agreement because they want to hold something up and bring it home. When he was about 100 yards from the creek bank, Harlan turned off the flashlight. The eastern sky had begun to gray very faintly, just enough to give the tree trunks edges. He heard the creek running. Then he heard another sound, heavy breathing, deep and broken. Not bear, not elk. Then a soft metallic rattle, like something large shifting its weight inside a cage. Harlan stopped behind a thick cedar. His heart was beating hard, but not fast like when he was young. It beat the way an old man's heart beats, when he understands he may not be strong enough for what comes next. He looked down at his hands. Empty. No gun. Only old scars, leather gloves, and the smell of metal from the pliers in his pack. Beyond the trees, in the dim light before dawn, something large was being held near the creek bank. Harlan couldn't see Rune clearly yet, but he could hear the steel cage rattle once more, and somewhere, farther off, very faintly, came the sound of human footsteps on wet gravel. Derek was coming too. Daylight hadn't reached the woods yet, but the mistake human beings had made was already awake. Harlan tightened the straps of his pack over his shoulders and bent forward out of the shadow of the cedar. For the first time in many years, he walked toward danger without carrying a gun, and it made his mouth go dry. But it also made his mind strangely clear. Some mornings, a man doesn't know he has changed until his hand stops reaching for the old object. Harlan didn't know how this morning would end. He only knew that the sound of metal could not be the last sound Rune heard from the human world. Harlan saw the cage before he saw Rune. It sat in the dry bend of the creek behind the cedar stand. The cage had been covered with wet fir branches, but the steel bars still showed through, black and cold in the gray light before dawn. It wasn't a store-bought trap. Derek had modified it, reinforced it with 2 extra crossbars, tied the anchor cable around an alder trunk. Whoever set it knew he wanted to hold something larger than a bear. Rune stood inside. It didn't smash against the bars. It didn't throw itself at the walls of the cage like a panicked animal. It stood with its head lowered, both shoulders pressed almost against the steel on either side, its long hands gripping a front crossbar. Its black-brown fur was wet with mist. Its left leg, the leg that had been trapped in the ravine 8 months earlier, rested slightly farther back, but its eyes were clear. When Harlan stepped out of the cedar shadows, those amber eyes found him immediately. Harlan stopped outside the cage's reach. He needed to read the whole scene. Cable around the tree, a spring latch at the top door, a secondary lock with a safety hook, several strips of dried venison scattered across the cage floor, clearly used as bait. In the mud, fresh boot prints led from the service road down, then curved toward the opposite creek bank. Derek had gotten here before him. Rune released a very low sound. Not a greeting, not a plea, just a heavy note in its chest, making water droplets on the steel bars tremble faintly. Harlan placed one hand against his own chest and signaled for it to stay still, though he knew the gesture might mean nothing. Rune didn't move. Its huge hand kept holding the steel, but didn't squeeze harder. It was still choosing not to destroy everything around it. He moved closer to the door mechanism. The cage lock sat on the left edge, with a pull pin and a trip cord hidden under leaves. This trap wasn't just meant to catch, it was meant to photograph, to hold. Harlan reached in to find the release point when he heard gravel scrape behind him. Derek stood on the far side of the creek, up on the bank. A camera hung around his neck. His right hand held a short hunting gun. His face was flushed with excitement. His eyes kept jumping from the cage to Rune, then back to the camera, like a man who couldn't believe his own luck. Derek spoke fast. He talked about proof, about how no one could laugh anymore, about the press, money, fame, and all the things Harlan had heard before from young men who believed the woods had just handed them a ticket to a different life. He told Harlan to step away from the area. His voice tried to sound hard, but the end of each sentence shook with too much joy. Harlan didn't answer. He looked at the gun in Derek's hand, then at Rune. Inside the cage, the giant creature began to straighten. Its head nearly touched the roof. Its shoulders opened, making both sides of the steel frame shudder. The cage suddenly looked like a toy built by mistake around a living tree. Rune didn't throw itself against the door. It only stood to its full height, and that sight was enough to change the whole creek bank. The growl came out short, low, and thick. It didn't stretch the way it had in the ravine 8 months earlier. Harlan felt it in the bones of his chest before his ears caught up. Derek backed up 2 steps. The gun in his hand lifted slightly, then dropped, uncertain. If Harlan had brought a gun, maybe that morning would have gone wrong. Guns tend to pull every eye toward them. They drag the story onto a road that can't be repaired. But his hands were empty. Only a folding knife, pliers, and a very quiet anger. He moved away from the cage and stepped into the shallow creek. Derek said something else, called this history. Harlan kept walking. On the far bank, Derek was taller than he was, but much younger. Young in the most dangerous way, still believing that rare things belong to the first person who can film them. Harlan snatched the camera. Derek reacted half a second too late because he hadn't expected a limping old man to do it. Harlan pressed the latch, opened the cover, and pulled out the memory card. Derek cursed and reached to grab it back. Harlan looked straight at him for the first time that morning. No speech, just the look of a man who had seen too many animals die because young men needed to prove they were right. He snapped the memory card in half. The crack of plastic was small, but to Derek, maybe it was louder than a gunshot. Harlan dropped the two pieces into the creek. They turned once in the white foam and disappeared between the rocks. He closed the camera cover and placed it back in Derek's hand. Derek stood frozen. The gun was still in his hand, but now it looked useless. Derek said Harlan had no right. Harlan didn't argue. Rights are what people bring up when they no longer understand what has been broken. He only turned around and waded back across the creek. If Derek wanted to shoot, that would have been the easiest moment. Harlan heard the breathing behind him, heard gravel roll under a boot sole. Then nothing. At the cage, Rune was still standing upright. Its amber eyes stayed on Harlan. Harlan heard his own breathing inside his damp collar. One part of him was still waiting for Derek's gun to fire. The rest of him focused on the lock, as if it were an old knot that had to be undone by hand, not by anger. Harlan knelt beside the mechanism. The main pin was hooked with a reverse spring. It had to be lifted first, then pushed to the side. He used the locking pliers to hold the pin and the knife to scrape mud out of the slot. Derek had made the cage sturdy enough to show off, but not smart enough to understand that every mechanism in the woods is hated by mud. Behind him, Derek's footsteps slowly backed away, not running, not stopping either. He moved like a man who had just lost something before he had even owned it. Harlan didn't look after him. That was no longer the most important thing. He remembered all those nights when Rune had stood at the edge of the yard and never crossed the thin grass, even though nothing real had stopped it. That memory made the cage in front of him feel even more brutal, not because of the steel, but because of the confidence of the person who built it. The latch popped loose on the third pull. The cage door opened a crack, then gave a shrill creak as Harlan pushed it wide. He stepped back at once, his hands down by his sides. Rune didn't come out immediately. It lowered its head and looked at the opening, looked at the creek bank, looked at Harlan. Then it stepped 1 foot outside. The left leg came down after it, limping slightly. When its full body was free of the cage, the steel trap suddenly looked small and stupid, something human beings built because they couldn't imagine the size of what they wanted to catch. Rune stood beside Harlan for a few seconds, not shoulder to shoulder, not touching. Only close enough for Harlan to smell wet fur, rotting leaves, cold creek water, and feel the warmth from that enormous body. He looked at the creek ahead, where the two halves of the memory card had vanished. None of the ones who had reason to harm had done anything. Derek had a gun and didn't shoot. Rune had the strength and didn't chase him. Harlan had no weapon, no wise reason to stay. And yet, he stayed. Was that courage? Harlan didn't think so. Courage is often a word outsiders use when they don't have to pay the price. To him, it was the result of 8 months of leaving water on the porch, picking up creek stones, and watching a creature larger than himself respect a distance no one had drawn for it. When the time came to choose, his hands had known before his head did. Rune turned toward the forest. It walked slowly. Before moving between the cedar trunks, it stopped for the briefest moment. It didn't fully turn its head. It only angled one shoulder, as if listening behind it. A black-brown shape dissolved into the gray light, and the creek kept running. Harlan didn't feel as if he had beaten Derek. There was no victory on that creek bank. Only a bad thing stopped before it could grow into something worse. Harlan stayed a while, then pulled the cage door all the way open, removed the main latch, and threw the spring onto the gravel bar. He didn't have the strength to drag the whole cage back, but he made sure it couldn't close again. That took nearly half an hour. By the time he finished, both hands were numb, and his right leg hurt as if he were dragging a sack of stone behind him. When he got home, Buck was waiting on the porch. The dog sniffed his hands, sniffed his jacket, then leaned its head against Harlan's left knee. Harlan stood there, breathing out into the cold wind. Morning had fully arrived. The log house looked the same as it always did, except everything inside him had shifted out of its old place. He went into the living room. No coffee, no clean clothes. He stood in the middle of the room and looked at the trophy wall. Roosevelt elk antlers curved upward in the pale light. The grizzly hide covered half the west wall. The cougar jaws sat inside a small glass case. For so many years, those things had answered for him. Harlan pulled a chair close to the wall. He took down the first set of elk antlers. They were heavier than he remembered. Dust fell onto his shoulders. He set them on the floor. Then the grizzly hide. Then the glass case with the cougar jaws. One piece at a time. Not thrown, not smashed. Just no longer left up high. The objects looked smaller on the floor when they weren't hanging above him anymore. Maybe they would still seem beautiful to someone else. To Harlan, they were only weight. The work lasted until noon. Buck lay in the doorway, watching. When the last piece had been set down, the wooden wall showed through empty and pale, lighter than the boards around it because of all the years covered over. Faint rectangles, small nail holes, a few old scratches. Not beautiful, but true. Harlan sat down. For the first time he looked at that wall and didn't see the past standing in front of him. Only wood. Space. A place that didn't need to answer right away. He didn't know what he would hang there later. Maybe an old map. Maybe the first fir branch Rune had left. Maybe nothing at all. That last thought made him feel lighter. Sometimes an empty wall isn't an absence. Sometimes it is the way a house stops bragging about what its owner once took. That afternoon, Harlan stepped onto the north porch and set down the water bucket the way he had before. Only water. He wasn't sure whether Rune would ever return, and for the first time, that didn't make him restless. A boundary that has been respected doesn't have to be tested every night. He wasn't in a hurry to understand everything that had happened. It was enough to know he hadn't let it become a new hunt. When darkness came, the forest edge remained quiet. Harlan sat by the window, looking at the place where Rune used to stand. No dark shape, no gift, not even an answer. Only fir trees, light rain, and the thin strip of grass between his house and the woods. He rested a hand on his right knee and felt the ache still there. But in the living room behind him, the empty wall waited in silence. And Harlan thought that, for a man like him, that silence might be the kindest lesson the forest still had left to give. There is one detail in tonight's story that stays with me longer than the big scenes. Not the moment Rune stood cramped inside the steel cage, though just thinking about that image is enough to tighten a person's throat. A creature so large, the cage built for a bear looked like the wrong size, shoulders pressed against the steel on both sides, head almost touching the roof, breath trembling through the morning fog. That scene is powerful. But what I think about more happened earlier, inside Harlan's log house, while it was still dark. He stood in front of the gun cabinet. The key was already in his hand. For someone like Harlan, opening that cabinet didn't need thought. It was like pulling on a coat, stepping into boots, and picking up a flashlight. 40 years in the woods had taught him that a man with a gun has more distance between himself and death. But that morning, after the sound of metal snapping shut by the creek, Harlan set the key on top of the cabinet. He walked outside empty-handed. I think that's where the story truly changed direction. Not because Harlan suddenly became gentle, not because he stopped being afraid. An old man with a bad right leg walking down to a creek before dawn, knowing there was a trap, knowing Derek was out there, knowing there might be a weapon, saying he wasn't afraid would just be a lie. But 8 months earlier, at the bottom of the ravine, he had seen an enormous hand settle flat in the mud. That hand could have broken him. It didn't. It chose a different gesture. And sometimes, one silent gesture lives longer than a whole sermon on morality. What strikes me is that Rune never tried to prove gratitude in the way humans want. It didn't bow its head, didn't step into the yard, didn't let Harlan touch it. All it did was stand at the boundary, keep its distance, and leave behind small things. A fresh fir branch, 3 creek stones, a strip of birch bark still smelling of sap. At first it sounds strange, but in nature, exchanges like that aren't completely foreign. University of Washington researcher John Marsloff is well known for his studies on American crows. Crows can recognize human faces, remember people who have threatened them, and pass that information to other crows in their group. There have also been reports of crows leaving small objects for people who regularly feed them or treat them consistently. Bottle caps, shiny bits of metal, seeds, sometimes even food. Science doesn't have to call that emotion in the human sense, but it does show one thing clearly. Some species have a social memory complex enough to distinguish who is a threat, who is a source of safety, and who might be worth answering. The concept of reciprocal altruism also lives in that same territory. One individual does something that benefits another and later receives some form of response. It doesn't require spoken promises. It doesn't require consciousness exactly like ours. It only requires memory, repetition, and the ability to recognize an individual. So if we accept Rune as a large primate species, long-lived, observant, and capable of respecting boundaries, then those gifts on the porch don't look like magic anymore. They look like a very old language, rough, slow, and real within the logic of the forest. And then Derek entered the story. I don't think Derek is a simple villain. The more frightening thing is that Derek is very easy to understand. He wanted proof. He wanted a photo no one could deny. He wanted a video that could change his life. If we're honest, many of us would want to look too, to photograph, to post, to hold on to one piece of a legend to prove we were there. But some things are pulled out of the place they belong the moment they're captured. The remaining question isn't whether Rune is real. In this story, the harder question is this. Between Derek, who brought a weapon and a camera to hunt for fame, and Rune, a creature strong enough to crush a steel cage but still waiting in silence, which one is closer to the word civilized? I don't have a neat answer. I only know Harlan found his own answer when he broke that memory card and dropped it into the creek. He didn't save a piece of historical evidence. He saved a silence from being sold. And sometimes, the kindest thing a human being can do in front of a secret isn't to drag it into the light, but simply to turn the camera off. If you were in Harlan's place, would you do the same? Would you dare destroy the one thing that could make the whole world believe, just so a creature could keep living at the edge of the forest, free from being hunted by a crowd? Leave your thoughts below. And if this story made you look differently at the things that should stay hidden, hit like, subscribe to Bigfoot Sasquatch Stories, and keep walking with me into the next files. Thank you for walking this path with me tonight. I'm Victor. Remember, the boundary between myth and reality is much thinner than you think. See you next time.